Welcome to the CEC Report for August the 15th. I'm Elisa Barwick, and joining me this week is Robert Barwick. Welcome, Robert.
Thanks, Elisa.
On this week's show, FSI boss says Australia depends on foreign investment, so must conform to bail-in. And development is the only name for peace. So firstly, our regular viewers will know we've been talking about the financial system inquiry repeatedly, week after week now. A few weeks ago, the financial system inquiry released its interim report and has invited feedback, and we've encouraged people to make submissions to that, and you can find the details on our website.
The submissions close on the 26th of August, so there's just a week or so to get them in. If you haven't got a submission in, get it in.
And they've also started this week their public meetings, which are in most capital cities. And for those who hear this in time, there are meetings next week in Brisbane on Tuesday 19th and Sydney on Wednesday 20th, and you can see again their website for details. Now, we had people at both the meetings that occurred this week, 2 nights ago in Perth and last week in Melbourne. At the Perth meeting, which was not well attended, and probably they wanted it that way, they haven't exactly promoted it. They say they want feedback, but
it's kind of an in-house thing. They'd like to keep it if they could.
And we did have a number of supporters that were there and were able to raise the concerns that we have, particularly about the proposal to bail in depositors in the case of a failing too big to fail bank, and raise Glass-Steagall as the alternative. One of our CEC activists was able to raise what happened in the 1930s and how the banks made millions at the expense of people that lost everything. And David Murray, the chairman of the inquiry, said, look, that was then and this is now, and that the markets basically will solve everything, to which our activists said, well, why are we even here? Why are we discussing this if the market supposedly will solve everything? So obviously they will not. Now, Robert, you were part of a contingent at the Melbourne meeting last night, and Murray was confronted repeatedly again with bail-in, which he was not too comfortable about. So how did he respond?
Well, Murray is a banker, and he responded like a banker. The reason he's in charge of this inquiry is because he's a banker. He was the chief executive of Commonwealth Bank from 92 until 2005 or 6, and he is there to make sure that the bankers get any changes to the financial system is ones that they approve of. And as a banker, he doesn't like Glass-Steagall. Now, he will sound almost the opposite, because he himself last week put forward the idea of ring fencing, which acknowledges there needs to be some kind of separation in banking between investment, the retail banking with deposits and risky investment banking. But they want it on the Vickers model in the UK, and that whole ring fencing system over there, it's not to actually do a separation. It's what Vickers came up with because there was a huge demand in the public and in the Parliament for a full Glass-Steagall, which freaked the bankers out completely. So they came up with something that could look like it but not be it.
And you were able to go through this last night at the
meeting. Well, I put to him the quotes from esteemed members of the House of Lords in their debate last November, which we actually read out in this show last week.
And which he claimed to be familiar with.
No, he did, because they've travelled around the world actually. They've gone to the United States, they've gone to the IMF, they've gone to London. They've got international advisors on their financial system inquiry, such as an Australian who's a top hedge fund manager over in London. So they've gone around. So I knew they were familiar with it. I was reading out the quotes, and some of the financial system inquiry panellists were smiling, especially at the one where one lord said that bankers are adept at getting around anything. They can get between the wallpaper and the wall, and they were smiling at that because they know, right? But here's the thing. Murray didn't answer the question. He just deflected it. Right, they didn't want to do that, but there were so many. The Melbourne meeting was more well attended than the Perth one. There was probably 40 to 50 people there, but there were quite a few CEC people and people that had been informed by the CEC. That's why they went along, and there was so many questions on bail-in and Glass-Steagall that at a certain point, Murray couldn't keep just deflecting the question, and he kind of lost his composure a bit. Now I want to play him responding to a question on bail-in, where he finally says, like, all right, that's enough. Here's what you need to know. And just listen to what he says now on this question.
One other comment I'd like to make about G20 and foreigners. Australia has 5% of the world's land mass and 0.3% of the world's population. To be successful, we have used foreign capital ever since we started our modern life in this country. And we've used that capital to invest, save and grow. We still use that foreign capital, and amongst advanced nations we have a very high net foreign liability position. We are dependent on foreign capital. Now, if we're dependent on foreign capital, we cannot go to say to the capital markets of the United States and Europe and their regulators that don't mind us, we're going to have our own set of regulations irrespective of what you say.
But does that mean we're not a sovereign nation?
Well, I've made the point quite clearly that we are dependent on foreigners for savings. If we want to change that dependency, we better run the economy in a very different way.
I'm just going to circle around here, so there's one people there.
So what you've just heard, Elisa, and is him saying, very similar to the comments that Joe Hockey makes, that, hang on, we're in debt to these overseas creditors and their system. They're in charge of us, right? We have to do what they say. And the supporter, the person who said then, her name's Mandy, she's a CEC supporter, she said, well, does that mean we don't have any sovereignty? He was a bit lost for words because that he was acknowledging that's actually what that means. We need their money, right? Therefore, we have to do what they say unless, thanks Mr. Murray, unless we go with a whole new financial system. Well, come to mention it, that's what we'd like to talk to you about.
Yes, exactly.
Because of course, what the CEC is fighting for is a financial system that is based on sovereign credit, where you don't rely on foreign investment. It might be a nice thing in some cases, but it's not necessary. And the two wars we went through, World War I and World War II, when we couldn't get foreign investment, we flourished under the bank that he worked with for 40 years, the Commonwealth Bank. He started working in 1966, David Murray, right? In Perth, on the first night, when he was asked about the Commonwealth Bank, he said, oh, it had to go because it had no capital. Well, history tells us when the Commonwealth Bank started, it started without capital. The first governor, Denison Miller, said, we don't need capital, we have the full credit of the Australian country behind us, right? And we need to go back to that, but of course, as a private bank, representing the private banking fraternity, they don't want to do that, and they're determined to put a lid on the push for proper Glass-Steagall and such things as national banking that would take us back to that. So what's particularly worrying on that particular quote is he had just said, not 3 minutes earlier, he had said about bail-in, he said, listen, bail-in means different things in different jurisdictions. So in Europe, it's involved deposits, but in Australia, we have a guarantee of deposits. So it wouldn't really involve deposits here. But then he acknowledged that it's all up in the air anyway. And then to say that, he's basically saying he undid everything he just said, because he's saying, well, at the end of the day, we have to conform to what they're telling us, and we know what the G20 want.
So even though we're a different jurisdiction, we have to go along with the global system.
Yep.
Now, after the break, we're going to talk a bit more about exactly how Australia can participate in a new global financial architecture, which is already underway. This is already beginning to unfold across the world, thank goodness, because otherwise things would be looking rather grim. So join us back in a moment. Welcome back to the CEC Report. Development is the only name for peace. Now, we're going to talk about the way out of the mire of war that is going on. No sooner do you turn on the news that there's a war in one part of the world or another.
But it's not separated things. There's just this huge build-up of tension between the you could say the East and the West again, and this is deliberate.
And by way of update, there's been quite a dramatic escalation in the last week since we did the CEC report coming out of the United Kingdom. Prime Minister David Cameron has called for permanent NATO forces on the ground in all the Baltic states, although this is expressly forbidden by NATO's 1997 treaty with Russia.
It's Lithuania, Estonia and Latvia, the ones at the top north.
And this would include a ready reaction force targeted at Russia. Now, this was backed up by a House of Commons commission on the subject, which released a document about this, and the Atlantic Council, which is a British think tank. It will be further discussed and consolidated at the 4th of September NATO summit, which David Cameron is hosting in Wales. Now, this is an immediate provocation to Russia, to war, and Australia's support for it was evident when Julie Bishop, the Foreign Minister this week, criticised Russia's attempt to try to help Russian-speaking citizens in eastern Ukraine who are living now under horrific circumstances in war zones in eastern Ukraine. And this was on the subject of the humanitarian convoy of 287 trucks.
Well, there's two cities that are under complete bombardment, and they're large areas of this region of eastern Ukraine, large cities, and because our media, what we're force-fed in Australia is largely dominated by Murdoch, one of the leading neoconservative lunatics in the world. They're just giving us this line, and so we hear about the humanitarian crisis in Iraq, but what's going on in these cities under the bombardment of the Ukrainian army in eastern Ukraine is horrific, right? And so there's this flood of refugees across the border, but there's people that wish they could have left and they hadn't been able to leave, and they regard it's too late to leave now. So what Russia has done is they've put together a convoy to supply humanitarian aid to those cities. Now, we are led by our government, the Australian government. We are poo-pooing this as a pretext. So Julie Bishop said, any intervention, and remember she's saying this with the death stare, right? Yeah. She's got the death stare all lined up.
And the snake brooch.
I think she's some kind of love child of Darth Vader, actually. So she can do the death stare without the mask. So she's got the death stare going. She goes, any intervention by Russia into Ukraine under the guise of a humanitarian crisis will be seen as the transparent artifice that it is. And Australia would condemn in the strongest possible terms any effort by Russia to enter Ukraine under the guise of some kind of humanitarian mission. Now, think about what we're doing in Iraq now. Yep. There's a humanitarian crisis. We're intervening in, suppose, that sovereign country, which is not a sovereign country. The US just said, change your prime minister, and they have, right? But we're intervening in them. Tony Blair, Elisa, spent from 1999 onwards saying the treaty that's underpinned international law since 1648, the Peace of Westphalia, upon which sovereign nation states were respected, has to be torn up, and we have to have a system where you can have any power like the United States and England can invade any country under the responsibility to protect. If there's a humanitarian crisis in there, we can go in and we can fix it.
Yep,
right?
Without any permission.
That's right. So they claim that right to themselves, but Russia has a clear case here, which we just don't know it's a crisis because our media's not covering it, and they're trying to downplay or ridicule Russia for trying to do it.
And Julie Bishop should be well aware that this entire convoy and this entire mission was organised at a special session of the UN Security Council called at Russia's initiative to organise this food and medical relief. Russia is acting in cooperation with the Red Cross, with the Organisation of Security and Cooperation for Europe. It has the permission of the Ukrainian government, who will put inspectors on those trucks at the border. These convoys travelling without a military escort. Yep. I mean, everything's going to be checked.
Well, let me just say, and what you actually have to conclude there, because the Red Cross, OSCE are involved, etc. What Bishop and Abbott are doing, Elisa, is they are abetting the Nazis, self-described Nazis, look it up, in the Ukrainian military, who are trying to slaughter as many of those eastern Ukrainians as possible. They are actively abetting them by trying to block any humanitarian attempt to look after them.
Absolutely. And I want to raise some of the causality behind these wars that are going on, because as you said earlier, these are not isolated occurrences that are breaking out for separate reasons relating to that particular region. And for more information, people can refer to our Australian Alert Service, which is a weekly publication. If you call in, we'll give you a free copy to that. And for those regular viewers, you should subscribe. Go to our website and find out how to subscribe. Now, I'm going to refer to this article on the back page of this week's Alert, Bernard Lewis, British Svengali Behind Clash of Civilizations, because this article explains how ISIS was able, because you think of it, I mean, here you have no ability with the power of all the array of Western governments to intervene on this force called ISIS to save, you know, relative handfuls of people on a mountaintop. So how did that come about? Well, there's this figure that we talk about, Bernard Lewis, who was in the British Arab Bureau. I'll just give you an example of how he has propagandised to build up Islamic terrorism over many decades. And this was an article that he wrote in the New Yorker in November 2001, so after September 11. And it was called The Revolt of Islam. And in this article, he justifies Islamic terrorism and their fight to rebuild an Islamic caliphate, which is what ISIS has just declared, the Islamic State. Essentially, this is the old Ottoman Empire, which collapsed at the end of World War I in 1918. In this article, Lewis states that sooner or later, Al-Qaeda and related groups will clash with the other neighbours of Islam, Russia, China and India. And even as early as 1960, he actually argued for the revival of an Ottoman Empire that could be used as a British geopolitical battering ram against Russia and other states. And he even glorifies Osama bin Laden, among other things. So ISIS would not be in the position it's in now without that kind of propaganda and without the practical assistance also that the West has given them in such theatres as Syria, Libya,
exactly.
etc.
Because, see, after World War I, when the British and French drew up the borders of what's now the Middle East countries, you know, it was a colonial plaything for them. But some of those countries wanted to develop as sovereign nation states, right? And you'd had the Russian Revolution and the communists took over in Russia, and some of them went with the western side and some of them went with the eastern side, but there was this desire for development and to be sovereign as nation states, and that didn't fit in with British plans. And so what British intelligence did with people like this guy is they thought, we need to get the fundamentalist Muslims fired up so they can take over these countries because they're pretty easy to manipulate, and then we can use them as a battering ram because they're right, look where they are on the map, they're right on the border of Russia, right on the border of China and India, etc. And that can be a useful geopolitical ploy, and that is what governed everything from the Lebanon war in 1982 to the Iraq invasion in 2001 to the policy they've pursued ever since. And each time, all these terrorists that are so horrific now, poor old Russia, even before it was Russia as the Soviet Union, has been fighting them since the late 1970s, right? Yeah. And they've been warning the West, don't go down this path, but we did, and now we see the full face of it.
And a collaborator of Bernard Lewis, Zbigniew Brzezinski, literally called this geopolitical way of looking at the world as the grand chessboard.
Yep.
Now we're going to take a quick break and talk about the development perspective to counter this after the break. Welcome back. So we're going to talk now about the asymmetric response to this war push coming from Russia and its collaborators in the BRICS nations, which is Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa, plus further collaborators. Now, basically it's very clear the old financial system is evaporating, and in the face of that, these countries are uniting to develop a new financial system. But it's based on development, which it has to be, rather than the fictitious values of today's monetary system of worthless derivatives, trillions, quadrillions of dollars of derivatives. So what you have is a series of agreements and arrangements, and I'll just list a few to give you a sense of this. You have new currency and exchange arrangements that have been signed on to between Russia and India, where a working group of the two central banks have developed a mechanism for using national currencies for mutual payments. The same thing is being developed between China and Brazil. You have development banks that are being opened up. The BRICS at their summit recently forged a new development bank to fund development, which would rival the World Bank, and also China's Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, which was discussed at the ASEAN meeting last weekend, which Australia had representatives at. A credit system, and this is the crucial thing, to fund the development. Now, a leading advisor to President Putin of Russia, Sergei Glaziev, has revealed, and I quote, a plan for fast-track development of the Russian economy on the basis of a new technological order. This plan, he said, includes a transition to a sovereign monetary system underpinned by internal sources of credit, an active policy of innovation, and support for progress in science and technology. And with the sanctions put on it, Putin actually chaired a meeting recently of the military-industrial complex, in which he said, look, we've got to upgrade our high-tech economy. We can definitely produce everything we need ourselves. There's new trade agreements that have opened up under the sanctions regime. There's a massive expansion of trade between Russia and Argentina, including with very high technology products, particularly in agriculture.
Yeah, the cattle growers in Australia are losing out to that, Elisa, and it's not, and it's our government's fault. And
some of the commentaries are saying, you know, even while Argentina's stock markets are in the red because of their so-called technical default, this flourishing trade with Russia and other countries is taking off, so it's a bit of a paradox.
Yep.
You have a massive increase of trade between Russia and Egypt. Putin just met with President el-Sisi and reached an agreement to establish cooperation between Egypt and the Customs Union of Russia, Belarus and Kazakhstan. Russian-Indian trade will be enlarged, and there's discussions of building a new natural gas pipeline which will be confirmed when Putin goes to India in December. Meanwhile, the sanctions are backfiring against Europe. You just had 3,000 trucks of peaches, for example, and nectarines produced by Greece that were turned away at the Russian border. So this new system, though, represents a new world economic system based on real value of increasing the productive powers of labour with new technologies and development, rather than the fraudulent massive financial paper under the current financial system.
Yeah, because since, you know, apart from the communist bloc, from the 1970s onwards, in the West, everything just went more and more down the path of financial deregulation and free trade. And then with the fall of communism and the end of the Soviet Union, all those countries were expected to just sacrifice their economies to the same thing. And the only people who benefit from free trade are the multinational corporations, who then get to sit in the middle of what the people in each country need, and we all have to go through them, and they make massive profits, and we lose our production, and we end up paying through the nose for everything. So this is all being changed, and actually the other thing Sergei Glaziev said, because the credit thing he announced is the most significant of all, right? Breaking with the power of international finance, but he did make the interesting point. You've talked a lot about Russia there. He kind of said that a lot of what's been done against Russia is actually targeted at China, which is a much bigger deal than Russia in some respects, because China is the way Russia is doing a lot of Russia is the way China is interfacing with Europe, and this is targeted at both countries and using Russia as the big bad guy at the moment.
Exactly, and one of the other things Russia and China are in agreement on is space development, going back to the moon, looking at helium-3 development for power production and things of that type, which
helium-3 would be a fuel for fusion, which would be incredible for the planet.
Yeah, very exciting. Now that's all we've got time for this week, but go to our website for more on that, and join us again next week for the CEC Report.